Hi, my name is Ben Martin. I'm a researcher in the Department of History of Science and Ideas at Uppsala University. The work I want to present today has been conducted in partnership with Humlab at Umeå University and supported by a grant from the Swedish Foundation for Humanities and Social Sciences, Riksbankens Jubileumsfond. Now, as a historian who has come relatively recently to the digital humanities, I have noticed that a good bit of the work is awfully complicated. At the same time, a recent trend in digital text analysis has been to embrace radically simple approaches. For example, the literary scholar Sarah Allison has argued for the virtues of simplicity in her work on reductive reading. Approaches like this one have been of value to me in my research on the history of the idea of culture in international relations. I'm especially interested in following such ideas through practices, that is, trying to see how concepts were formed not just what people have written about them, but through what diplomats and other international actors did, not just what they said. One thing diplomats do a lot of is sign treaties. And in the 20th century, they have signed an interesting kind of treaty for my research, cultural treaties, bilateral agreements explicitly devoted to arranging or controlling cross-border exchange in fields like culture, education, science, fields identified as cultural. So as one part of this project, I've been seeking, with help from Humlab, to use digital text analysis to explore conceptual content and change in this set of diplomatic texts, since there are a lot of them. This kind of treaty grew a lot in the 20th century, and there are over 2,000 to work with. So can digital analysis of the texts of cultural treaties offer us insight into the intellectual historical questions I'd like to ask? And if so, what are the methods and the workflows that would be most appropriate for this task? Inspired by work by Allison and others, we've chosen to apply a straightforward form of quantitative word trend analysis, integrated with analysis of metadata about this corpus, and then tested and expanded through full text searching of the treaty texts. By formulating this approach in a specific relationship to the nature of the corpus and the questions I want to ask of it, we're able to get quite a lot out of this simple or even reductive method. So in the paper I present to the conference that's published, I describe the approach, share a few provisional findings, and offer some methodological reflections. In this oral presentation, I'll try to do those things in a concise fashion. So first, a word about the corpus. We curated an entirely new corpus composed of the complete texts of all bilateral cultural agreements that were deposited with the United Nations Treaty Service between 1946 and 1972 in English translation. These are signed by countries from all over the world, although not to an even degree, which is something we'll come back to. I mean, that is, certain countries have signed many more of them than others. The UN asks countries to submit all bilateral treaties they sign, and these were published in book form until the 1990s. They've all been scanned in, and you can download them from a devoted website of the United Nations Treaty Service in PDF form. So we did that and curated them manually as text files, and came up with a corpus which represents about 45% of the total number of cultural agreements signed in this period, and in a quite representative fashion. So how do we know how to identify the relevant agreements, you might ask? Well, that leads us to the metadata part of this, namely that our source, these cultural treaties, is accessible as two data sets. On the one hand, we have the treaty texts, as I said, but the other crucial element of this project is the World Treaty Index. This is a freely available online database that seeks to record the basic data about every bilateral treaty signed in the 20th century. In addition to giving each treaty a unique ID number and data like the two parties, the dates of signature, the textual source, and so on, the WTI assigns each treaty a topic, and one such topic is culture. Now, determining exactly which agreements to use within this category has proven to be a very complicated issue that took me a long time, but this is not the place to discuss that in much detail. On the basis of some decisions, in any case, we came to a corpus of about 470 documents, coming to about 500,000 words. So a distinctive feature of this corpus then, as some of you will no doubt already have thought of, is its relatively small size. This has meant that some digital analysis tools were just not very useful. certain things, well, topic modeling, for example, which is the kind of go-to method for a lot of the kind of research that I've been reading, proved in the efforts we made to just not be very helpful. Another feature of our corpus is its thematic specificity. That is, it consists not just of treaties, but of treaties that have already been defined in a particular way, that is, as cultural. Now, the fact that these treaties are already marked as cultural means that whatever we can find out about their specific content is itself a sign of what the label cultural was understood to refer to at different times and by different diplomatic actors. So, in other words, I'm trying to treat cultural not as my analytical category, but as what historians call a native category, right, that assigned by actors at the time. So on that basis, then, the exploration we can do of word trends in these texts can help us to identify features of what this concept, cultural, may have meant. That's the idea. Now, it's true that a control group would have been nice, that is to say, a body of non-cultural treaties against which you could compare, for example, word frequency, etc. But of course, that would have meant preparing, I mean, that just wasn't practical for reasons you can understand. Such a control group doesn't exist and would have been enormously time-consuming to create. Instead, I think it's not such a big problem because we have found ways to distinguish general versus specific content of the treaties by knowing something about the typical textual content of treaties in general and then contrasting that to what we find here. So let me now take a step toward what Allison calls reductive reading, that is reducing the texts. Now, one way to begin was to ask what fields of activity seem to be addressed in these documents. And then, according to the logic I just explained a moment ago, we could say that these are fields that are being treated as cultural. Such fields are likely to be referred to through nouns, and so reduction step one was to use a part of speech tagging tool and reduce the corpus to a collection of nouns in the ways identified here. These are custom-built tools that were made for me by the good folks at Humlab that we have on Jupyter pages. And then we identify the most frequent ones. So here we see top 15 most frequent nouns per decade. And you can't quite see the top ones in the 1970s, but what you can see they're the same, right, as the others. A certain kind of language which is treaty generic, that is, treaties have lots of articles and they refer often to the country that does this and the country that does that. They come up over and over again, right? Those are treaty generic terms. But as you scan, you can see pretty easily towards the bottom of these lists words that are evidently referring to their content in some other fashion. For example, study, art, education, culture, language. So moving on then, we took the top 50 and manually, that is to say, my eyes scanned through these and identified ones that seemed to reflect cultural content in the body of treaties. And what you can see is that the fields being considered include activities in the realm of aesthetics and symbolic production, the arts, letters, education, science, also sport. And you might think that's awfully broad. At the same time, it does not include a lot of the things that an anthropologist would consider under the term cultural. No property relations, no sexual relations, no marriage or religion or food. So right, we've already got somewhere in terms of identifying what the culture of cultural treaties is. As a next step, we count words in such a way as to get also to their frequency, as you see here, and then compare frequencies of particular terms over time. So here we have, you see the relative frequencies of 3 terms, art, education, and science, drawn over time. How can we read a graph like this, or a visualization like this? We see perhaps different phases before and after 1960, where a kind of things seem to settle and establish a certain sort of pattern maybe after 1960. Another thing, at least, that we see quite clearly is that the term art has 2 quite extraordinary spikes. And what can account for that? Let's focus on that second observation for a moment. Were particular countries responsible for this sudden relative increase in references to art in these 2 spiked periods? We can start by finding out which states signed most cultural treaties during those years. So at this point, I'll return to the treaty metadata in the World Treaty Index. This is what it looks like, big Excel file. And searching for the treaties marked as cultural in the source marked as UNTS, right? That's the treaty series from the UN. we see that indeed, a number of these agreements, a large number of them, were signed by socialist states. And no fewer than 16 of them were signed in the 2 years, 1956 and 57, were signed by the Soviet Union. So was a focus on art a particularity of the socialist states' approach to bilateral cultural exchange? Well, in order to confirm this, we can then do the third part of this program, where we would do a single word search in the texts themselves. You could do this in more or less any text editing software. Here you see a frame from Visual Studio Code, opening a number of the treaties and searching for the term art. Takes us to one, and you can go through like this. And doing it in this way, we find that indeed the treaties of these years that use the word art are almost all signed by at least one socialist state. So this is a finding, that when socialist states, led by the Soviet Union, signed cultural treaties, they defined the cultural to include art to a higher degree than non-socialist states earlier in the period had done. It might, to show another example of what we're doing, another way to do this would be to look at a particular word that spikes up at a particular time, and one such term is sport. Here, however, is the slide about the point I just made. Sport first appears among the top 50 nouns in 1956, and again raises questions. Why then? Which states seem to have thought that sport was cultural? And this is a simple count of the number of treaties by country. Who started signing cultural treaties to a large degree in 1956? Well, the Soviet Union. And again, you don't need to stop there. You can compare breaking up the word counts by countries. You take the socialist states and their word counts on one hand, and the Western European states, for example, on another. And you can see that, that indeed the socialist states account for the use of that term to a much higher degree. So let me, in a few minutes here, conclude with a few methodological reflections. First, my work with these methods has underlined the importance of the choices I've had to make about how to define and delimit the corpus. It's clear that small changes in the treaties I choose to include or exclude can make a big difference in my findings, especially given the relatively small size of the corpus. Second thing is, to my mind, it suggests the power of reductive reading, that using digital analysis to, as Allison writes, provide daringly simple approaches to complex literary problems, or intellectual historical ones, I might add. We found some analytical value, I think, in radically reducing these texts to their parts, in this case, nouns. Finally, I think our work shows the value of an explicit, iterative, multi-tool and multi-scalar workflow. I'm inspired here by work like Wevers and Verhoef's article about Coca-Cola, in which they outline an iterative text mining workflow in which they move between n-gram viewers, full text searching, and close reading of particular newspaper texts, and they diagrammed this out. Likewise, I've found that the 3 levels, or even 4, that I've used here, word trend analysis, quantitative work with metadata, full text searching, and then some actual close reading of particular treaty texts, creates a workflow that allows me to explore these materials in a way that gives you some breadth as well as some focus, some richness, and sensitivity to context. So I would join Wevers and Verhoef in not wanting to choose between distant and close reading, and instead finding that the goal could be to find ways to go back and forth between these. So keeping it simple, for me, and for now at least, has proven to be a solid means of developing a workflow that seems analytically strong while also being appropriate to the scale and the nature of my materials. They offer me a way, that is, of letting the digital humanities do for me what I want them to do for me, which is to help me do intellectual history. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.